in the climate emergency. And of course, the Adani project represents some of the worst possibilities in terms of unleashing a whole lot of not only carbon emissions but also impact on our natural environment. So we have previously taken a strong position and a strong stance to send a message to, in the previous case, to financial institutions, including Westpac, that we were not interested in doing business with organisations that do business with the Adani coal mine. In this case, GHD, which is a business which is part of the Adani project, the proposal here is that Council writes to GHD to request that they cease their involvement with this project and obviously the associated infrastructure. We can't make that decision tonight to withdraw, and for a very good reason, because that would constitute a contractual breach which does not necessarily serve our purposes, and hence the proposal here is to send that signal very clearly, to give them an opportunity to consider their position, and of course for us to receive a report by the end of this year regarding the implications if we were to withdraw in that case. So I make that very clear because I understand that that in terms of the sort of advocacy, it is easy to say, well, let's just pull out for any company that's actually engaged or involved in that project. That's not a decision that we can make this evening, but a decision we can make this evening is to send a very clear signal about our policy objectives, our expectations of GHD and other companies that are engaged with that project, and to signal very clearly that this is something that we're looking at, and in order for the work to come back to us this year, so before Christmas, so that we can make a determination on a way forward. I hope that GHD hears very clearly the message that we're sending, which is that this is a completely inappropriate project for Australia on a whole lot of grounds. There are other things to get involved in, other ways to make money if that is their primary objective, and certainly not something that is effectively letting off a carbon bomb in our climate and also having a significant impact through the Adani coal mine. So I'll end it there. I hope the councillors can support this proposal and of course support the strong advocacy efforts that we've taken over many years on this front.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. I've got a second of it. Councillor Lawrence, did you have a question?
Yeah, question.
Sure, go ahead with your question.
I note there's a point 4, an action out of this. Can officers tell us who GHD is, what they do for us, what's the likely outcome of writing a letter in terms of the current contract, etc.?
Sure, thank you.
Obviously, it's notice of motion, so, you know.
Yep.
And is there any financial impact for council?
Thank you. I'll refer that question to Ms Bishop.
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mayor Rennie. So GHD, they work internationally as well as nationally. They have a very broad brief. They can do anything from asset management, engineering, to commercial business modelling. And they obviously support resources and mining sector. Point 4 is a very good suggestion, and having worked with GHD actually previously with other councils, I don't know what, I'm not going to anticipate what their response will be, but I think they will take the request from council very seriously. Will there be any financial implications for us? Not in writing the letter, but when it comes to the fact that we do have contractual arrangements with them, there are 2 very complicated pieces of law that we need to consider. One is the competition law and one is the administrative law, which we've touched on before. So it's very important that we give councillors good advice should there be no response from GHD towards the end of the year.
Thank you for that response and thank you for the question, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Amir.
Darebin's work in divestment from fossil fuels and putting pressure on organisations and community groups and others to divest from fossil fuels is something that's been a feature of this council since the beginning of the term. So this is a natural progression of that, and I thank Councillor McCarthy for identifying this opportunity. And of course, many of us are motivated by wanting really good environmental and social outcomes, but for those who are focused on the bottom line and getting dividends for shareholders, divestment, and including in this case where it's advocacy for divestment is something that can be really effective at a broad scale. So I'm glad that we have this opportunity to play our part in that as part of the range of climate emergency actions that the council is taking.
Thank you, Councillor Mayor. Are there further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Yes, I'd just move a amendment, point 6.
Yes, if you could read it out slowly, please.
Yes, receives a further report on conducting an ethical audit of all our consultants.
Is that acceptable to the mover and the seconder?
I'm just not sure what ethical audit means. Is it in relation to along the same lines?
Councillor Lawrence, can you clarify what you mean by ethical audit?
Given I haven't got a seconder,
I'm just wondering if the words are right.
I'll refine it. I'll say receives a further report on conducting a environmental and social justice audit, ethical audit on...
Can we remove the word ethical and just social justice audit? Receives a further report on conducting an environmental and social justice audit.
Yeah, I think the ethics is implied there.
Yeah. Councillor McCarthy, is that acceptable?
I'm inclined to accept it. I would just check in terms of the officers, whether the term consultants is the correct term. I appreciate Councillor Lawrence's intent. I welcome it, but I'm...
Consultants and contractors there.
Okay.
Covers
Can we get some advice from the officers on that?
Sure,
Perhaps, and before... Ms Bishop?
Mayor Rennie, through you, could I just seek a point of clarification when it comes down to environmental and social justice audit? And yes, in relation to consultants and contractors, is that existing ones or future as well?
Happy to add existing and future in front of...
So your intention was both?
Yes, because...
Okay. Ms Bishop, the intention was both.
Yes, I will need to come back through council, through you, Mayor Rennie, via a briefing. That's quite a brief there. I will bring a report back to ensure that council know what's involved in that piece of work. Thank you.
On that basis, happy to accept it.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. That's been accepted by the mover. And seconded, Councillor Lasserf.
I have an additional amendment, if I may.
Yes.
It's a second sentence to point 5, and it reads, sorry, it was going to be point 6, so I'm trying to make it point 5. Include in the report, identification of any other companies engaged with or at risk of becoming involved with Adani's project.
Okay, is that acceptable to the mover and the seconder?
Yep, that's fine.
Thank you. That's been moved. We'll fix up the...
In the report, identification of...
Okay, we'll tidy that up. I think the intention is clear. Thank you. So that's now the motion we're debating. We've heard from Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Amir, did you speak? Yes, you did. Any further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Just a question.
Yes?
Actually, I can read in my sentence.
I just had a question through you to the CEO. Just the word, the amendment that's in bold says any other companies engaged with, says at risk, and I'm just not sure what that means. Like, are they?
I think it means thinking of signing up to.
Savage
Can we
Club,
not? Can we
or-
avoid wordsmithing? I think it's.
It's called at-risk companies.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, can I put another amendment to finish my sentence?
Yes, sure.
that council has contracts with.
Okay. That council has contracts with, okay.
At the end of that sentence, project, yeah. Sorry.
Happy to.
Okay, I'll take that as a further clarification on what we had, and let's keep moving. So are there further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Mayor Rennie, yes, I welcome this motion, which is really good because it introduces some of our policy positions that we pass often in this chamber, and obviously some other people call us, doing feel-good motions, but it is important that our environmental and our social justice and our ethical positions in this council are communicated to those who we have business relationships with. And that would actually make, especially with consultants who are giving advice and planning and things, align their practices more closely with us. Now, obviously, in this case, we're not threatening any existing contracts with existing parties, but we're laying that out. And I suppose why I've asked the extra point 6 is that I think our community, put a lot of demands on us on a range of areas, from environmentalism through to treatment of human rights, through to animal rights and animal welfare. And so the kind of filter or the kind of audit I'm seeking is like an ethical investment type filter that some certain super funds engage in, where we actually identify where there's a non-alignment with our values. Now, I'm not preempting what might happen from that, but it might mean that we get to write a few letters.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Any further speakers? No, we'll put that straight. Oh, Councillor Greco.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Look, I'm going to speak in favour of this motion, and I'm glad that further 6th point has been put in there. I think it's important that we look at all possible angles in relation to the Adani company and try to work out as a council, as a tier of government, where we can put limitations on the other companies or organisations that deal with Adani, and that we actually make an informed decision whether we actually want to deal with them. I mean, in the union movement, that's in a way they're called secondary boycotts, but and that's why it becomes really tricky. And I take the point made by our officers is that it's a really tricky process. Trying to get this right, and I'm glad that we're calling for a report, because I remember, I'm not sure if this council or the previous council, where we tried some of these things, particularly around ethical investment in terms of how the council's funds and reserves are banked, and we came across all sorts of obstacles, both in relation to competition policy, in relation to Local Government Act, in relation to the procurement requirements and things. So it's really going to be a really tricky process to navigate. But I think from a report of this nature, not only does the focus on Adani will help us also to identify how we can use this approach for a multitude of other areas that we're, in terms of our social policy. We've done a lot of work in relation to gaming, and we've done a little bit of this in relation to gaming, in relation to our gaming policies. So it'll be really interesting to see how we can extend that. You know, if you look at the tobacco industry, if you look at, as Councillor Lawrence mentioned, some human rights abuses and things like that. So I think that the work has to be really comprehensive, and I'm glad that we've given quite some time for something to come back for us to consider in a holistic way.
Thank you. Any further speakers? No, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion was carried. We'll note that that was unanimous. So that brings us to item 10.2, climate emergency. I'll take that as moved by Councillor McCarthy and seconded by Councillor Lassurf. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillors, of course, would be aware of the extensive work that we've done as a council, not just in-house and in partnership with our community, including many groups and businesses and civil society organisations, but also with other councils and organisations beyond our immediate remit. And one of the reasons why is that we stipulated very clearly in our climate emergency plan adopted in August 2017 that we are stronger together, and by virtue of working with and inspiring others to take this journey with us, that we will build a powerful movement that will make an enormous difference. We have seen some of that difference occur already, and you just have to look at the media feed to see all the local newspapers talking about the local government power purchasing agreement, which has attracted 48 local councils to be involved in, and to see the benefit of our climate emergency framing investing in some work there, which has actually had a ripple effect across the local government sector. It has not only had a ripple effect across the Victorian local government sector, though, it's actually had an impact across the globe. And at the time of writing this motion, there were over 1,000 cities and jurisdictions around the world that had declared climate emergencies. As of about 10 minutes ago, there were 1,123, and of which 62 are in Australia. That is double the number of jurisdictions in Australia that have declared climate emergencies than when we last spoke about this in this chamber, following a webinar that we hosted here in Darebin with those cities around Australia. And out of that webinar, we proposed to create a national network of climate emergency cities and like-minded organisations, which was referred to as a Climate Emergency Australia. Not just councils, but in fact a whole range of organisations. That network has continued to operate and function, and has been really, I suppose, the benefit of the work of councils and councillors working together. Just recently myself and the Mayor, in fact, both happened to be in Darwin and met with the Lord Mayor of Darwin, who was really pleased to talk with us about what they're doing. A city that on autocorrect sounds very similar to Darebin, has facing a vastly different situation, serious natural weather events that we don't get here, but enormous opportunity to rapidly transition. So the opportunities for us to partner with cities around the world, and particularly around Australia and here in Victoria, are clear. They're evident. We are doing those things. Climate Emergency Australia is the national network that we need, that partners with the various social and environmental movements that are also acting on the climate emergency. And so there is the opportunity here to look at what Darebin's role is going forward in this. We've played a leading role as the facilitator. How do we want to proceed on that basis? So
10 seconds.
I have a few ideas. I know that our community does as well, and I really want to get that process underway for us to formalise that by the end of the year.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Lasserve.
So we have been on a bit of a journey on the climate emergency since being the first council in the world to make such a declaration. We've been on a journey to figure out what it means for us. And as more and more councils and levels of government make similar declarations, as Councillor McCarthy says, people have been coming to us going, what does this mean and how does it change the way that we do business? And we've been figuring it out along the way. We adopted the Climate Emergency Plan, and we continue to build on that base of work that we did back in 2017. But there is still a lot of work to do in terms of defining city action or local government action on this issue in terms of the emergency or the mobilisation response. I think by putting some time and effort into developing a network of governments, organisations and anyone who wants to come and talk about climate emergency mobilisation, it will really help us put our heads together to not only define a course of action for ourselves in terms of what we can control, but bring our voices together and be stronger when we're advocating to the state and federal governments about the changes that they need to make. They need to embed climate emergency decision-making into every decision that they take each and every day, whether that's health or transport or planning or mining and resources and shutting down coal mines. We will have a better chance of creating and building the momentum to shift their minds if we come together. And that's what I see this network helping us to achieve. To close, I just want to commend Councillor McCarthy for his efforts in this area. He has been pursuing this idea and supporting climate emergency Darebin through some of this thinking.
10 seconds.
And a lot of his time as well. And I think that this wouldn't be as far ahead as it is now if it hasn't been for Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you. Any further speakers? Councillor Amir.
There's now millions of people around the world who are living under jurisdictions that have declared a climate emergency. And when I think about that, I think about some of the earlier discussions I had with community advocates in the climate space, Darebin residents, some of whom are now on the Climate Emergency Darebin Committee. And the vision that they had was that if Darebin declared a climate emergency, then maybe we could sort of pressure Moreland into declaring a climate emergency, maybe Yarra, maybe then over a number of years we could get Victorian states to declare a climate emergency, maybe further down the track we'll get a state jurisdiction and move through to then federal level and international. But somehow we've skipped a few steps and gone pretty quickly from Darebin, not just around Victoria and around Australia, but across, I think, to, if memory serves me correctly, every continent except Antarctica. And if you count some of the countries that have Antarctic land, maybe you can even count Antarctica. So to have such a rapid response has been really exciting. But along with that, I suppose, does come some responsibility, and myself and I'm sure other councillors as well and council officers get approached by other people from other councils saying either how do I implement a climate emergency response, or whether it's from the getting councillors on board and helping people to understand the context or the practical application. And we kicked off some of those discussions with the Climate Emergency Conference, which was wonderful, but it's very clear that we're figuring this out as we go along, as Councillor Surf alluded to, but we are still a few steps ahead, and if there's an opportunity for not just us but for all councils and multiple jurisdictions to be sharing learnings, I hope and think that we will be able to move together much more quickly to continue to amplify that outcome.
Thank you. Any further speakers? Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I too would like to commend Councillor McCarthy for his work on this motion and over the last few years on this, as well as Darebin Climate Action Now, Climate Emergency Darebin, and all our other community groups working on this issue. I agree with Councillor Amir that when we first declared the climate emergency in 2016, it seemed like something that, might just be, those stereotypical inner city councils. But last week we had Moonee Valley Council declare a climate emergency. And I think that indicates that we had a presentation about climate recently where someone said, you get the first person on the dance floor and they're dancing all alone. But when you get 6 people on the dance floor, then everyone can go on the dance floor. So I think when we got Moonee Valley signed on for a climate emergency, I think we're doing really well. And I don't think I could possibly have anticipated that 3 years later, the language of climate emergency would be such mainstream discourse that everyone's talking about. And I just wish that we could push the state and federal governments to act more. I think this is a social movement that has a lot of legs, and I think we've only got a limited amount of time to get on with it. So I really commend the idea of Climate Emergency Australia. And going forward into the council elections next year, I hope that council candidates across the country are getting pressure from their constituents to declare a climate emergency if their council hasn't already.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Councillor Lawrence.
I just had a grammatical question because I think the intent of the motion is to get a report, but point 4, this is a proofreader in me, goes direct to a verb, and the verbs include X, Y and Z, and then later it has a clause about it's back to the report. That really should be a dot point of 3 and shouldn't be starting with a verb.
Sorry.
It's just how we write motions. It's because this could actually be read to be committing extra resources straight away because of just some clumsy grammar.
Thank you. Councillor McCarthy, you've wordsmithed this. Do you feel confident that the officers understand?
I think if and I would seek officer advice, but I take Councillor Lawrence's point.
I'm not sure the solution.
I think that one solution, if I can ask just for some advice through you two, maybe a governance or others, is whether with the above report should actually be a separate point 5, whether it should just read council.
The other way.
I can offer, given that I haven't spoken, maybe I can offer an amendment.
I can't amend my own
Yeah,
motion,
that's right.
so
Okay.
I'll offer an amendment, and the amendment will be at point 4, and I hope this captures it, that includes in the report prominent ongoing recognition on its website, and would that cover it? I mean, put a couple of words there?
I've got a nod from the CEO. Can we accept that and move on?
Yeah, because I understood it as being part of the report to come up with a whole
Thank you,
list of-
Councillor Greco, for that
Yeah.
helpful contribution. I think at some point it would be good if we could avoid wordsmithing and trust the officers to move on with the intention. So I'll ask on that basis whether that's acceptable to the mover and the seconder. It's acceptable, yes. Okay, thank you for that amendment, Councillor Greco.
Can I just briefly speak in
Sure.
relation to it? Look, I support this motion, and I'm glad that it has come to council because, you know, some of the feedback that I have had, and it's been very positive feedback about Darebin and declaring a climate emergency and being the first to declare a climate emergency. But the next question then rolls off people's tongue is, so what does that mean for Darebin? So what is Darebin doing that's different to, you know, to other councils and things like that? And I think that, you know, whilst we could mention quite a few things that we are doing, and we are doing a lot of work in this space, you know, as distinct to other councils, I think a report like this would be quite welcomed in order for us to really unpack what it means for a council to declare itself to declare a climate emergency. And I think that work will be important because otherwise we may get into a situation where declaring yourself as a council that climate emergency, it may ring hollow with councils that actually go down that path. So if we can actually do some of that work, articulate what that actually means, and then other councils that actually come on board or look to us know what the commitment will be if they do come on board and declare themselves or declare a climate emergency in relation to their operations. So I commend the request for a report, and I look forward to it towards the end of the year.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Lawrence. You have spoken, I think, or did I incorrectly write that
Asked
down?
a question.
That was just, okay.
Just speaking in favour of this motion, and I think that's cleared it up, those couple of words, so that can't be used by climate change deniers to say, oh, we're rushing off and committing resources, etc., etc. No, we're getting a detailed report. Probably the only thing missing in this motion is two words that are very important, which is a just transition. And Darebin's activity in this space isn't just words and motions or associations or that are being built here. It is through the Solar Savers program, which brought together social justice and climate change in a very real way, that renewables can save disadvantaged communities money if governments act. And that's now been copied at a state level. And so I think the credibility of Darebin is there in this space, not just being the first to declare it, but actually doing the actions that are required, which is we need to have collective arrangements so that climate, adjustments to your lifestyle aren't a luxury item, that they're available to all people to start making those changes.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. That brings us to item 10.3.
Mayor, look, I may have a procedural motion, just that if we can just slightly change the agenda to hear 8.5, because I'm just conscious that there are people in the gallery, and 8.5 deals with the Reimagining Ruthin draft master plan consultation.
Thank you,
And
Councillor
if we could just
Greco.
move that forward. Yeah.
I'm quite keen to finish with the NOM. So can I suggest that the motion be that we finish the last of the NOMs, which is yours, and then we'll,
I thought we already finished the noms.
Then I'm happy. So we would do the NOM. So can I have a motion to that effect that we will move 8.5 in before we move to 8.2? Moved by Councillor Surf, Councillor Greco. All those in favour? Okay, so for those waiting for 8.5, we've moved that forward, but right now we'll go to 10.3. Councillor Greco, I'll take that as moved by you. Is there a seconder?
Yes.
Seconded by Councillor Lawrence. Thank you. Councillor Greco.
Okay, look, very quickly, Councillor, this is a fairly straightforward motion. As we heard tonight, unfortunately they've had to leave. That there were a number of traders here tonight from Reservoir, particularly from the Broadway side of Reservoir, and I understand there were some people also from the Edward Street. What the issue is that these traders are really feeling the pinch in relation to their actual livelihoods. As we know, and as it was mentioned before, trade has actually gone down in relation to particularly Broadway, down to 75%, down by 75%. And so many of the traders are actually doing it really tough, to the point where some of the traders organised a rally to stop the trains at the Reservoir station, and over 20 police were there to try and calm the situation. That's the level of frustration that the traders are experiencing. So the disruption that's occurred, like many traders have said, if it was 1 or 2 weeks, fixing up a footpath, traders are used to that sort of stuff. But here, as we've seen, already 6 months, and it's significantly impacted their business. And we know that in order to complete the rail crossing will take up to 2 years, 18 months to 2 years. Many of them feel that they will not be on the others, they will not see the end of the rail crossing because they may have to close their businesses because of they just can't meet their bills and their expenses, and because they're not getting the trade that they had. So they've been fighting with the state government and particularly the rail crossing authority in order to get some assistance, and actually been asking for some compensation in relation to what's happening to them. That's all fallen on deaf ears. There's been some attempt that has been made, which is it's nothing really substantial. I know that council has been trying to help out, and as was mentioned earlier before, we have an officer working with them, but obviously that is not enough. I think we need to step up our game in relation to these traders. These were the very traders that actually got us to this point to get the rail crossing removed. They're the ones that have been fighting with council over the decades to get this rail crossing removed. So we owe it to them in order to support them. So what this motion does is basically is asking council to come back at the next meeting with a package of initiatives that council could do in order to assist these traders. And not only initiatives that council could do, so we have to look deep and hard in what we're currently doing and what we can better provide, but also how we can support and advocate in a stronger way, side by side, in solidarity with the traders in relation to the state government so that they get a better deal than they're currently getting.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Lawrence.
Yes, Mayor Rennie, I'm supporting this motion for an urgent report. And obviously we heard tonight's from officers and from yourself about actions council has taken around the $750,000 spent supporting reservoir level crossing removal. But this is about a more urgent matter where we know the wall that was created by the railway line separated trade in that long strip and weakened trade. So the point where at one point we didn't even have ATMs or banks on one side. There's some ATMs been introduced, which is good. But this actual process of the construction has increased poor trading conditions at a time when we've got 2 quarters of recession occurring in Australia. So there are people there who have had their trade halved. There are people there who have got 80% reductions. Now, in this city, we operate, unlike Moreland, we operate with a 1.75% rate valuation on all commercial premises. So they're actually paying nearly double what businesses in Moreland are paying, but suffering extremely harsh economic conditions. So I would hope that this isn't about, media or spin or a tax or whatever. I'd hope we also look at a package of rebates for businesses under hardship and maybe a deferments of rates and things, because this is 6
10
months
seconds.
and they're really, really suffering, and it will take them a while to recover.
Thank you, councillor Lawrence. Any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. We'll now move to item 8.5 as reordered in the previous motion. Reimagining Rutherford. Moved by councillor Newton, seconded by councillor Greco. And there is a submission, so before we get there, we will hear from the submitter, Serena O'Malley. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor and councillors. Subject to some corrections before it's released, the draft master plan is almost exactly what the Ruthven CRG sought from the beginning of the process. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of the officers in the beautiful design of the draft master plan, which will enhance community consultation and education. I'd just like to raise 3 points. The first is in relation to a statement in the consultation plan which says, ensure that we consult with community that are not represented on the CRG, cold community, young people, senior community and families. I'd like to point out that the CRG has 2 second-generation migrants of Italian and Dutch background, an Aboriginal person, an older person, somebody with a young family, a former student of the primary school, and oversight from the former and now elderly principal of the school. We're as diverse as the community that we represent. Having said that, of course, community consultation is essential to the process. There are 2 substantive issues that I'd like to bring up because the final draft didn't come back to the CRG members for feedback. And these few words it would be helpful if these few words could be redacted before it goes out to public consultation. And those are references to a local farmers market, when in fact the community engagement summary referred to local markets on page 16, and also reference to a world-class teaching and research facility, which is definitely overly ambitious for a 3-hectare park. I'd also like to make the point about the biodiversity plan. Getting the biodiversity plan right is the absolute key to making this site a success. And in particular, the master plan strongly advocates for Indigenous species, known as species of local provenance, which are important because they're genetically better suited to the local soil, temperature, rainfall, wind conditions, increase the success of revegetation process, and so on. So I really urge you to make reference in your motion to the biodiversity plan process and those who will be consulted. Thank you.
Thank you for that submission. We'll now move to the mover of the motion, Suzanne Newton. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So I'm really pleased to move this item to release the Reimagining Rutherford Draft Master Plan for consultation. I'd really like to acknowledge Serena in the audience and the rest of the Rutherford Community Reference Group who have been working really closely with us on this for 2 years now. And I'd absolutely agree with Serena that it is a diverse group and that we've really been able to come a long, long way from where we started. And also to Jennifer Lully, who's done an amazing job on this project. And just the way that we've been able to work together, and it hasn't always been easy, but where we've got to, I think, is really, really incredible. What I'm so excited about with this project is that from before my time on council, when we were talking about buying the school site, to now having it in council's possession, we've just come so far. So we had this huge family fun day in my first year on council, and since then we've worked with the reference group, and we've also worked with the Nature Trust to make this site a pilot site for the open space strategy. So we've come from talking about putting buildings on the site. That was definitely not something we want to do. So instead we've gone completely the other way. So this is a pilot project for the open space strategy. That means that we're going to be turning this into a bushland oasis over the next 20 years. And it's exactly what the Nature Trust showed us when we did a tour of sites and we saw what the parks we have now are like, which is sort of this English country garden sort of model that, you know, we mow a lot, we make things really orderly, and this is about doing the reverse, about connecting wildlife corridors, about having biodiversity, about protecting grasslands, about having more tree canopy on the site. I think it's going to be absolutely incredible for the area that it represents, which is a low growth change area due to the covenants around the site. It's got a community that has a lot of older Italians, older Maltese people, and it's got a lot of young families coming through as well. So the young families that are going to grow up seeing this park become something very, very special with, for example, even wetlands in the next 10 or 20 years is really, really something that I think council and the community should be very proud of. And I think it's a great example of the way that we can work with the reference group to really, really push something forward, and the Nature Trust as well.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, also I'd like to thank, to start off with the Community Reference Group for the work and their tenacity in pursuing this to the point that it is now. What we have before us is a long-term plan. It's taken 2 years in the making to actually get to this point. The plan has some really important key features. Some of the features are basically setting up a nature-based play space, and also seating, redesigning some of the seating areas and making them sort of conversation corners. And also, most importantly, some of the early work that will be done in relation to the master plan, as envisaged in the master plan, is the renaming of the park. And not only is it a question of renaming, but renaming using a Warrawong language. So that's a critical aspect of this early part of the work in relation to the master plan. And that'll be something after the master plan, eventually when it gets endorsed after the consultation period, that'll be something that council will be embarking on. Also, I think it's important to point out is that whilst it is a master plan, there's about $142,000 which has already been committed to the area, and that money is committed to removing some of the concrete that's there, and also to do some play space design, and also to do some tree planting in order to start to change, create a sense of change in relation to that space. Why that's important? Because as we know, the community has been fighting for this park. It secured the park, and now the only other point that I'll make is just a bit of a critique, is that 20 or 30 years for the completion of the park, I think is a little bit too long, and that's maybe something that we need to revisit in the future.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
I just have a question. I'm just trying to locate the page number of the officer report, which mentions local farmers market or world-class something or other.
We could ask the officers for that. Did you have... So, Councillor Lawrence, was there a reason you wanted to locate those? Was it in relation to making a change, or...? I think officers have received that feedback, so I feel fairly confident that can be addressed.
There was a request from the committee to redact certain statements. I'm just trying to locate them. And
sorry, are we going to keep moving? Councillor Lawrence, I believe that feedback has been heard, and I believe that we can actually appropriately address that. It's page 43. Farmers is on 10 and the others on 43. So while you're looking for them, I'm confident that can be addressed, but...
Yeah, move an amendment then.
Yes.
3.
Yep. And that would be?
That council redact references to local farmers market and the world-class, whatever it is. I don't know the word.
World-class research facility.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that acceptable to the mover and the seconder?
Yes.
And Councillor Greco, is that acceptable to you? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. That'll be formally done. Did you wish to speak?
Yes, thank you. Look, I'd like to congratulate people for their patience and hard work for 2 years to work through this process. For 17 years, the park in question was a joint park with the primary school, and that came to an end when the amalgamation occurred of the schools on Monies Road, the senior school. Well, it was a P to 12 school at that time, but it got bigger. So there was a lot of heartache in the community at the loss of the school, because obviously people had been to the school and sent their children to the school. And so that's where some desire in some sections of the community was to maintain some kind of community hall. But it was rather cruelly dealt with by a previous state government, and the buildings were allowed to fall in disrepair. People entered them, there was a fire, and the assets were bulldozed, which was the Education Department's assets. But that wasn't good enough. They actually bulldozed assets that were put there by the council and enjoyed for 17 years. My comment to the opposition at the time was, this feels like the reverse of government, you know, when things are taken away from the community. So there has been a lot of anger and a lot of frustration to buy this out of the open space levy, and the years have really gone by, because we're actually talking about the Napthine government, you know, that ended use of this. So it's been
10 seconds.
rather slow. So I'm also concerned about a 20-year span to establish it.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Are there any further speakers? Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to thank the work of the CRG, in particular in our officers, in getting us to this stage, and probably also recognise that this is one of those unusual projects that has actually seen collaboration from a couple of councils' consultative processes, the other one being, of course, the Darebin Nature Trust. And for me, this represents a really interesting intersection between the notion of place and how we plan for what is effectively going to be a new place, because the reinstatement and reimagining of Ruthven that is proposed in this master plan is actually doing something that I think a year ago or 2 years ago, in terms of the depth and the detail, actually wasn't even on our agenda in the way that is now articulated. And that's because of the sort of conversations that have happened between the CRG members and the Nature Trust, which has taken us that next step. And I mention that because whilst we're releasing this for consultation, and hopefully there is a really strong and positive response to the document, I hope we also find a way beyond the adoption at some stage in the not too distant future to maintain that engagement with those members in the detail. And I say that because when we adopt a master plan in this chamber, we're setting out a vision, which then becomes an operational piece of work. But there's a lot of community investment, both from a biodiversity and nature recreation point of view, but also a local recreation point of view. And I'm really pleased that we're removing references to farmers markets. It's not an appropriate use at this site. I think that in time, once the investment sees that that return of significant bushland character, then this could be the sort of place that people
10
come to
seconds.
see. But that's a long way off. And so I look forward to the work that happens now and beyond the adoption as well.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That brings us back to the agenda, and I propose that we'll now run through the reports in the order that they are presented. So that would be 8.2, Annual Report. Moved by Councillor McCarthy, seconded by Councillor Amir. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. It's always a good opportunity to reflect on where we are and where we've been when we get the annual report. This report, of course, takes us for the 2018-2019 year. There's obviously been some significant achievements in that previous year, which I think are worth noting, some of which took a long time to get to this stage. And one I would like to highlight is the adoption of the local law for the protection of trees on private property, which I would note has been in the works for 10 years to get to that stage. So I highlight that because having talked about that in this chamber in 2009, It took 10 years to get there, but I'm pleased that we finally got there. We also, as mentioned earlier in a previous item, hosted the first climate emergency conference of any local government in the world. And I just note that in the UK right now, they're doing exactly the same thing. And someone said, we better go and see what Darebin did so we don't just do the same conference that they did. So that's good to see. But there were a whole range of achievements in the past 12 months, and also things that we did which have set in train actions that are now starting to unfold on this council. One of which, of course, is the Age-Friendly Darebin report. And I have to say, that has been a piece of work which has surprised a lot of people in terms of its final result, to the point where in this chamber we had some of the staunch opponents of that process applauding the report and the path forward in terms of what it articulated. And to see us move from at the start of that financial year to the end of that financial year, that journey can be completed, and that clear vision and that collaboration between council officers, councillors and community get to that stage, I think was an absolute highlight of that year. I just also note that the satisfaction ratings in relation to a whole range of pieces of council's work have been high, and in some cases have exceeded the target. One I would highlight here is satisfaction with aged care, which I mentioned before, came in with a result of a 90% satisfaction rating against a target of 85%. Likewise, we had a similar result in relation to our festivals and events, 97% satisfaction against 85%. I pick out these two because one is one of those services that is delivered for a discrete group of people that urgently and desperately need some of those services to remain connected to the community. And the other one is something that's often, being our festivals and events, people don't always necessarily associate with being a council activity as well. So the ephemeral nature of what we do has to be measured and managed in that way. I won't go through the rest of the results, but I would just like to say a huge thank you to all the work of officers and
10
community
seconds.
members in getting us to these fantastic results, and of course to recognise that this is all part of what makes Darebin a really great place to live, work and study.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Amir.
Thank you. Councillor McCarthy has highlighted some of the biggest achievements and absolutely things that I'm very proud of as well. So I thought I'd focus on some of the other things included in the council report. The annual report. One thing I really like is the level of detail it goes down into, really enabling community members to see what we actually do on a day-to-day level. It lists things like how many briefings we have. It puts all our services together on one page, which is quite satisfying when often we're here in the council chambers and our minds are fully consumed with the work that's in front of us, and it's good to have that time to stop and reflect and see we do a lot of work. And that's absolutely a testament to the staff, the outcomes that we've seen here. There's a couple of areas where there've been delays, others where we've exceeded targets, but in most cases we see very high levels of satisfaction with our services, which is really wonderful to see. So there's real breadth here around the diversity of service delivery and tackling climate emergency, investment in physical infrastructure and creating community spaces. And something else that really strikes me in looking at this report is just looking at the sheer scale of the work that we do, talking about over 500 kilometres of council roads, over 136,000 phone calls taken in the year, more than 1 million books borrowed, and over 50 tonnes of waste. So it really is a great achievement to be able to deliver not just so many services, but at such a significant scale. There are some entire cities that have a smaller population than the city of Darebin, and it's really exciting to see it all captured here in the annual report.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Are there further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I'd just like to say a few words in relation to the annual report. Obviously to thank the staff, because what's in here is actually a product of the nearly 1,300 people that are engaged here at the City of Darebin. The things that stuck out for me from the report is that one is about the removal of all the four level crossings across the Preston area. That was something that we strongly advocated for. and also got to pay acknowledgement to the previous council that started that campaign and that we were able to actually finalise that campaign. And that's a great achievement for our city, even though it's not actual work that it's not capital works that we do, but that we strongly advocated for that to take place. And also, I think in terms of key achievements, something that's not mentioned as a key achievement, but I think it deserves to be mentioned, is the Solar Savers program, that we're continuing on with that. I mean, now it sort of goes by the by because we're so ingrained with it, but I think that needs to be highlighted. The other thing too that I take a particular interest in seeing actually who the work is performed by in the council, and this picks up on a point that Councillor Amir made in an earlier debate, is that actually the number of staff who are from a non-English speaking background are 15.7 according to the annual report, and not 40%, and that the number of staff, the number of people from a non-English speaking background in the city is about 33%. So there's quite a lot of work for us to do because we're sort of underrepresenting the community that we actually serve. And I think that's really important because given that we're a tier of government closest to the people, we should actually try to reflect the people.
Thank you, that's time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Yes, Mayor Rennie, I think there's, as usual, an amazing amount of work that goes on in this council, and we really need to acknowledge the deep experience that runs through this council, and sometimes people remark on the theatrics that might come from a Monday night meeting at the City of Darebin, especially people outside of the area. But that is actually about open democracy, where we openly discuss our issues, we don't bottle them up. But the work and the achievement in terms of 90% satisfaction with in-house hack and age service just goes to show that the federal government's obsession about deregulating this sector is ridiculous. People want a collective arrangement for looking after their relatives, and one where we have over 200 staff engaged in day-to-day services that are so valued, they actually almost double the satisfaction levels of our planning department. So this really shows the culture of Darebin continues, the service continues, and there's many other issues here. I'm very happy that we have got more action that's been taken to give land to the First Nations people here. That's occurred, and tonight we have more. I think that we're going to look at that issue again more. So there is some
10 seconds.
Great achievement in terms of diversity, in terms of advancing First Nation issues, and I commend the report in that regard.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Are there further speakers? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That brings us to item 8.3.
I'll move that, Mayor, but with the amendment, which the officers hopefully have available on screen.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. So before I seek a seconder, I'll make sure that people have an opportunity to see what it is you've moved. So I'll seek a seconder for that. Councillor Newton, thank you. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Councillor Newton, as well. I'll just go straight to the amended point to the officer's recommendation, which I have previously flagged with councillors in relation to a proposed change to the submission. As councillors would know from reading the submission, it does raise the issue that currently RSLs and clubs currently do not have to pay rates, despite the fact that they may in fact operate pokies and gaming machines. This seems completely counter from a policy consistency point of view, and I refer back to Councillor Lawrence's suggestion before about the ethics of what we do and where we spend our money, that we can, on the one hand, have a very strong gaming policy, on the other hand, the rating system under which we operate, which we do not control, but which the state government does control through various legislative and regulatory mechanisms, actually exempts what are effectively pokies operators from paying rates. And this seems completely contradictory. So the submission talks about actually that we shouldn't rate, so we should only rate those parts that don't have pokies, or rate those parts that do have pokies. I've suggested we should take a much stronger position, which is that if you have electronic gaming machines in your club or your RSL, then you should not be exempt from rates. You should be paying rates, because the effect of those gaming machines is doing irreparable harm on our community, and it is council and other organisations that end up footing the bill and picking up and trying to undo that harm. And I would note that this has been an issue in the media just this week, where we had a very important win on that front. So from a policy consistency point of view, we should be sending that message very clearly to the state government and, of course, to the ministerial panel. I think this is a fantastic submission overall. I think it is a very strong case for saying that some of the archaic elements of the rating system urgently need review. The rating system is a system that is about land ownership. It has its foundations in English property law. It is not a system that is designed to deliver social equity or social justice. And having called for rate reform over many years, and a system that is actually reflective of the need to fund governments, particularly local governments, to do what they do well, rates are by no means, and I think the submission makes this clearly, the ideal mechanism, but they are the only mechanism that this state government is prepared to countenance. I think we need to also be aware that this submission process is largely not about metropolitan councils, but about some of the land rating issues in regional areas.
10 seconds.
But it is an opportunity for us to advance these arguments, and certainly when it comes to exempt buildings and properties like gaming machine venues, they should not be exempt.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So I second what Councillor McCarthy said. I also believe this is a really strong application. I thank Alan and the team for their work on this submission. The rates is something that all homeowners have to deal with, but I do think it's quite complex, and I think it's wonderful that this submission talks about using plain English when the legislation is delivered. And I think it's really good that there's stuff in here about what we can do in terms of a waste services charge. Obviously, we've had really big issues with our recycling services over the last few months. So we do have to look at other ways to make sure that we have enough money to perform the functions that we need to. I think it's great that we can do solar savers now as a special rate charge, and I hope that we can continue that. I also think it's really, there's something that I really like about what we do now in terms of keeping unpaid rates and charges protected as a first charge on the land if it's sold. So what that means is that if someone can't pay their rates, what it means is that we can kind of not collect them, and then when a house or a property is sold, we can collect them at that point. So this is something that certainly I don't understand completely, but luckily our finance team do. So I'm very glad to be able to support this submission.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Are there further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
I just had a question.
Yes?
Just through you, Mayor Rennie, to the CEO. I was just trying to understand, obviously there's rebates and rates mentioned in this at the moment, understand how the rate cap affects Darebin in relation to the pensioner rebate that goes to 10,000, or I think it's 10,000 now, it used to be 12,000 households. And is the rate cap set before or after that rate is applied? I know I'm talking about, I think it's 1.6 million, but I'd get some,
Okay.
only, but it's something I need to clarify.
Thank you for that question. I'll refer that to Mr. Cochrane.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, the rate cap is applied before the pension rebate is applied.
Thank you. Does that make sense, Councillor Lawrence? And do you now wish to speak? Are there speakers?
I'd like to move some amendments. A amendment, right?
Do you have that amendment ready, or shall I see if there's other speakers while you're getting it ready?
I'd move amendment that recommendation 13 is deleted and that an additional recommendation is included to lobby the state government for equal treatment in regards to councils with pensioner rebates, with their own pensioner rebates.
Okay.
Yeah, can we see the word?
Yeah, I'll need to get you to actually have some words and read them out quite slowly so that we can capture those, unless you think you've caught it, Stephen.
Through Mayor, that recommendation 13 be deleted, an additional recommendation be included to lobby the state government for equal treatment. Now, the last bit I didn't get, equal treatment. Councillor Lawrence.
Equal treatment of councils with their own pensioner rebates. So it's just an end point in this conversation.
Councillor Lawrence, I've been advised there is no recommendation 13. Can I just check what it is that you're seeking to have deleted?
Okay. There's a recommendation regarding
The act to include that council's going to
lobbying
recover.
pre-legal costs to be, the Local Government Act to be changed to, and it's the officer recommendation, council recommendation, to lobby for pre-legal costs to be able to be awarded against late-paying ratepayers.
Okay, so that's the one you'd be seeking to have deleted. Okay,
I thought it was the 13. Maybe
Yep,
not.
sorry.
It's on the top of the page, so it's
Thank you,
connected.
Councillor Lawrence. I think I got some mixed advice there. Is that amendment acceptable to the mover and the seconder?
Sorry, as the mover, I'm just actually trying to make sense of the additional point, given we've just received it. So that recommendation 13, can we just have that read out again, what the specific wording is? Because
It's a yes or no question, so
I can't make sense of it, so I'm trying to give an answer.
that's probably, why don't you just say no and then we can move?
No, because I need to actually have it in front of me here.
I think it's on the top. Oh, your page is paginated differently.
My paging's different, Mayor, so I can't actually...
It falls
So
on the
you don't
top
know
of
what
the
we're
printed
removing?
page.
No, because it's actually different to what Councillor Lawrence has.
Okay, I'll get Mr Cochrane to actually show you so you know what's being removed.
If it
Councillor
helps,
Newton,
this
are you
is
clear
two
what's being removed? Just in terms of
I'm
what...
clear on what's being removed, but I don't support the amendment.
Okay, so that hasn't been supported. Councillor Lawrence, on the basis that the seconder hasn't supported it, we'll move straight to finding out if there's a seconder for your amendment. Is there a seconder for Councillor Lawrence's amendment?
So, is that the wording?
Point 3 is the wording of the amendment proposed by Councillor Lawrence, so I need to know if there's a seconder for that.
Need "and" in front of addition.
Yeah.
And an additional recommendation, yes.
Yeah.
Are you seconding that?
Could I just ask, before I second it, just to get maybe some clarification from the officers of how that will work? Yeah?
Okay, I'll seek that clarification
Just
from
so that
Mr
we get
Cochrane.
clarification.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, recommendation 13 being deleted is fairly simple. I'm not quite sure how to include the second portion of number 3.
Councillor Lawrence, just for the sake of clarification, was it your intention that the rate cap would be applied after the pensioner rebate had been taken into account rather than before? Is that what you meant? So that...
I think it needs an additional recommendation, and I'm not writing the recommendation here. I'm just saying there is an equity issue for us because of the large size of our rebate.
Okay, so we'd leave
I'm
that
not
to the
sure
officers.
how that gets addressed, but it
Okay.
needs to be put in front of someone.
Councillor, I'm still seeking a seconder. If I don't get a seconder for this amendment, it will lapse.
I'll second it because I want to hear
Okay.
the reasoning,
Yeah,
and then
perfect.
maybe that will clarify
Yeah,
things for
okay,
us.
so Councillor Lawrence, over to you.
Sorry for the crude drafting on this. I was trying to do 2 points that I've been reading this report earlier in the week and had noted. One, of course, is that recommendation 13 seeks that council can seek from the ratepayer pre-legal costs. So that's when the Skylarks or whatever they are come and knock on your door on a Sunday morning, the debt collectors and other things that have to go on. Currently, the Act allows us to get the cost back for going to court, and this one recommends that we can get those pre-legal costs. And I'm concerned about that because when people get a legal process, they kind of, sit up and pay attention. There's a lot of things, difficulties happen. People are overseas for 3 months, people are sick. There's a lot of reasons why maybe rates aren't paid. And I would hate us to be putting hundreds of dollars of extra fines on ratepayers who are vulnerable or their families are in turmoil for various reasons, because the legal process allows procedural fairness in terms of how things are issued, but pre-legal costs can build up before the family or the person is fully aware. And obviously there's people with mental and amnesia and all sorts of conditions who are in houses that are in disrepair and then get rates build up. So I'm concerned that we may, by allowing pre-legal costs to be applied, by asking that's something we should look at the social impact of before we rush down that lobby position. As for the second one, I think it's just worth noting, I'm not sure if it's 1.6 or 1.8 million, but that's a significant amount of money that we give back to our ratepayers who are on Centrelink and other payments who own houses. And the effect of the rate cap and the non-equity of that is an issue, that is not considered. And I would be saying we should actually be lobbying raising this whenever we have conversations with the state government, because we should actually have like 1.6 million less on our rate cap because of that. Look, there's some other things in this report. I'm a little bit concerned that we're locking into endorsing the current differentials. Probably we should talk about the differentials again and again, but I'm going to leave that alone.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Greco, would you like to speak to the amendment?
I'll reserve my right to speak. Yep.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to speak to the amendment? No? Back to you, Councillor Greco. Do you want to...
Look, after listening to Councillor Lawrence, and I just had a look at the clause 13, I think that given that we're providing some input into this discussion paper, I think it's worthwhile to actually put it there and that the council makes that recommendation. Obviously, a lot of work would need to go towards unpacking how that will actually be implemented, but that's something for the state government to look into. But I think it's worthy to make that suggestion to the state government and through this review process. I think it's important because we have lots of pensioners in our city, and also the fact that we have and administer a pensioner rebate. So I think it's all connected in relation to that. And as more and more people have difficulty paying their rates, I think something like this or a mechanism that comes out of this suggestion could be appropriate.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. I'll put the amendment to the vote. All those in favour? And against? Can I seek governance clarification? I've got a tied vote, but one who abstained. Does the abstention count as a vote?
Sorry. Hang on. I don't think the vote was tied.
Okay, I'll do it again. All those in favour? And against? No, it's not tied this time. Okay, so that's carried. Great. Thank you. We're now back at the motion. We've heard from Councillor McCarthy and Councillor Newton. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Greco.
And I have an amendment. It'll come up on the on the board. Yep. It's getting smaller and smaller. Now, I may ask for some assistance in terms of where that gets placed, whether it gets placed as
Let's
a point
not worry
B.
about that now. I think it's
and,
clear.
And the further point too that I didn't have a chance to is that this is a further point. Consider allowing councils to apply a progressive rating system to enhance greater vertical equity.
Greater vertical equity.
Enhance greater vertical equity.
Okay, is that acceptable to the mover and the seconder?
Sorry, before I can do that, I need an understanding of what vertical equity is.
Yeah, it's in the report. It's in the report. If you,
I'll ask. I'll take that as a question and refer that to Mr. Cochrane.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, in general terms, vertical equity refers to the concept that those who have more capacity to pay more.
Sorry, I should be clear. So it might be the wording, the way that it's appearing. So our submission, so that counts. So the way that this is being worded is,
it should be the review should consider.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
we'll add that. We'll take that as understood. Is that acceptable, Councillor McCarthy and Councillor Newton?
Yeah.
Yes, for me.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Greco. That's been accepted. Do you
Okay,
wish to speak
just
to the
very
motion?
briefly, I won't go over the other matters that have been raised. I'll just concentrate on these 2 points. These are points that I raised at a briefing, and when I was reading through the report, I didn't see them included in the submission that we made, or why these particular points were not worthy of being included in the submission. So I'm putting them back up, and I'm glad that councillors have supported me. The first one goes to the issue of differential rates. If you look at the recommendation here, and I've mentioned this earlier to the CEO, it's a bit vague, the language that we're using, and so the language that I'm using there is a bit tighter, and it makes specific reference to differentials in relation to social issues, particularly around gaming, where there was once a differential around gaming, and also a differential in relation to fast food chain outlets. And as we know in the community, there's a lot of debate around these issues in regards to these fast food outlets. The other point, so basically that point is to bring back differentials and enable councils to use their social policy as a vehicle into their rating structure. The other point too, it's a point that if you think of rates are a flat tax. They are a regressive property tax. And one of the issues that we need to address is that, and this issue is your vertical equity, is that those that have a greater capacity to pay should be paid more. How do you do that? It's not just simply because you've got a property that's got more value, of course you pay, but like income tax, there are marginal rates, and obviously the more your property is worth, therefore there should be a progressive rating system, that the rate in the dollar for those properties that are worth much, we're not talking about properties that are worth over maybe $5 million, that they should pay a greater cents in the dollar than somebody's property is only worth $700,000 or $800,000. So that's the notion of vertical equity, and that's the notion of ensuring that our rating system has a progressive nature in it, similar to income tax.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Lyons.
Yes, I'd like to speak to the substantive motion in support.
It is the motion, yep.
Yeah, the motion now, yep. Look, I'm glad Councillor Greco raised this point about having a progressive rating system, which he'd mentioned in briefings and is brought up again, because that relates to my one concern about this report, just locking in status quo support for the current differentials that we have, which have such things as vacant business and vacant retail at 4 times the rate level, which is aimed at trying to promote people not to just land bank and sit on shops in Plenty Road for year after year waiting for the big development in the sky to come, but to actually give a financial incentive to have people in there and not have them vacant. Now, at the moment, there's a state limit of 400%. Our report backs that kind of thing, and it's sort of too detailed to go in here and now. It's something we should really have many briefing sessions on, but things contract. I noticed actually we were getting 24 million from commercial rates and it dropped to 21 million as we get the Morrison recession coming further and further into this area. So, and then residential, as values go up, has been jumping up over 100 million. So there's over the last 2 years, there's some great changes occurring, and I think council should have flexibility to look at those differentials for reasons such as fast food, which we know sugar tax is being considered in other jurisdictions and have a major impact on our community. And if you look at the cancer map, it's red north of the Yarra, and if you look at it's blue on the other side, and it mirrors where the fast food is.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Are there any further speakers? Now, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Councillors, we're now at item 8.4. Before we go on, I would like to remind people we have 13 reports. We've been going at a rate of about 15 minutes per report. At that rate, we'll be finishing well after midnight. So it's up to you, but I would ask in light of that people actually think about whether you need to make further speeches if a speech has been made. And if people change their approach, I believe we can actually finish well before midnight, which I think is desirable. So let's move straight to item 8.4, Octopus School. Moved by Councillor Amir, seconded.
Procedural motion.
Yes, what's the procedural motion? Councillor Lawrence?
I would move a procedural motion that we defer item 8.11.
Councillor Lawrence, can we wait until we... Okay, it's procedural, so is there a seconder for that? So there's a procedural motion from Councillor Lawrence that we defer item 8.11. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Greco. All those in favour? And against? That motion is lost. So we'll go back to item 8.4.
Sorry, Mayor Rennie, before these items moved and seconded, could I suggest we reorder the agenda again to hear item... Sorry, I forgot.
We've started on item 8.4, so can we do item 8.4?
I don't know that you had a second... Oh, all right.
Well, I have a mover.
Can I just foreshadow then that we reorder the agenda to hear item 8.13 next?
Okay, I'll take that as foreshadowed. Let's get on with 8.4. I've got a mover and a seconder. I've got Councillor Amir and Councillor Williams. Councillor Amir.
Oh, wait, hang on. Well, I can say the motion.
Yep, thank you, Councillor Amir.
It is that Council resolves to select Reservoir Views Primary School as Darebin City Council's Octopus School for 2019-20.
Councillor Williams, can I confirm that that's what you wanted to second? Yep, thank you. Councillor Amir.
All right, I will keep this brief given that note. So this is the third year that we've been running the Octopus Schools program, with the previous schools being Reservoir West and Newlands Primary Schools, with ongoing support for other schools, including Thornbury Primary. So I'm really excited that we'll be supporting reservoir views this year. That we received 6 applications. All of the applications were very good, and I think I can speak on behalf of the panel in saying that we wish we could have 6 octopus schools that we were supporting. And although I can't go into the details of the individual scores, as in the report with the selection criteria, it was a combination of the responses from each school to the questions put forward, as well as some of the local context. So some of the factors we considered in local context, which were relevant for reservoir views, was giving greater weight to schools which had a high proportion of students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, considering the physical location of the school and council's ability to make meaningful physical infrastructure changes to make it easier for students to walk, cycle or scoot to school, and also whether those changes were contributing, again in a useful, meaningful way, to the broader network of active transport infrastructure across Darebin. So hopefully through this program, this school and others will be continuing to inspire thousands of students to be walking, cycling or scooting to school, hopefully a habit that will set them up for life, as well as creating and contributing to this network across Darebin to make it easier for people to get around using active transport methods. So thanks so much to all the schools that applied. I know it was a significant amount of work to do those applications, and of course to the transport team for their hard work, not just for this process, but all the work they do. They actually work with every single primary school in Darebin supporting active transport. So shout out to them. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor Williams.
I just want to say that the criteria was of a higher standard compared to previous years. And I just want to say a big thank you to those that did participate in the Octopus program, and to say congratulations to the Reservoir Views Primary School.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there further speakers? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. Councillor Lassurf, you foreshadowed a motion. It was to move item 8.13 to now. Yes. Is there a seconder for that?
Yep.
Against moving it?
Yep.
Well, yeah, okay. We'll have to have a debate on the moving it then.
Okay. My only reason to reorder the agenda is
Sorry, Councillor Lassurf, get you to stand up.
Is that one of the lasting members of the gallery from the public is come to hear 8.13, and the rate that we're getting through agenda items, she could be here for 2 hours, and I'm not sure that she would like to sit here for 2 hours to get to that item.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McCarthy, do you wish to speak to that?
No.
No. Councillor Amir, you wish to speak against it?
Yes, I know there's a community member I've been in contact with today who is desperate to speak to this item and is currently... oh, you're there now. Great, no worries.
Okay, great. All those in favour of reordering? Great, thank you. Clear that up. We have a submission on this item from Nadine Riching. Welcome. Please come up and make your submission. You have 2 minutes.
Sorry. That's all right. I'm so sorry. Everyone else saw me. Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Nadine Richings, lifelong member of Darebin, born and bred, lifelong member of Darebin and a member of the Darebin Nature Trust. The ecology of Darebin is the Victorian Volcanic Plains grassland, and it basically goes from the northern suburbs of Melbourne right across almost to the South Australian border. The Victorian Volcanic Plains grassland have basically been obliterated by human activity, and there's less than 0.1% left. We have remnant grasslands left here in Darebin. One is a 0.61 hectare piece of land in the north in Reservoir, and we are trying to save that. The Victorian government owns the land, or most of the land. Darebin Council, until about 10 days ago, owned a strip of land in the middle, which the Victorian government have now acquired through compulsory acquirement, just taken it from us. So they're basically destroying Darebin's nature. If they do this and they build on this land, they will not only, we will fail the Darebin no local extinction motion, the Victorian Government Biodiversity Plan and Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act will be failed, and the Federal EPBC Act will fail. It is a wildlife corridor. It's an open grassland for feeding for various birds. So I believe it is critical that we save this. It is also likely, highly likely, that it has Indigenous heritage importance. Indigenous in heritage importance. So that's basically just what I wanted to say, and we need to do everything we can to save it. You cannot replicate these grasslands. Thank you.
Thank you for that submission. So, councillors, I'm now seeking a motion.
Yes, I'd like to put a motion forward that's been circulated to councillors and I think sent to the team.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. I'll just get you
Yep,
to
that's
look
correct.
at that. That's correct. And seconded by Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Amir.
Thank you. So, in reading the report on this item, I was really disappointed to see that the state government doesn't recognise the really strong significance of this site. So, as we heard from the submitter, the Victorian Volcanic Plains grassland has been almost completely destroyed across Victoria. We are very lucky to have a small remaining patch here in Reservoir. Not only is it a small remaining patch, it's a small remaining patch on public land. So this is an amazing opportunity to be able to preserve this land before there isn't any left anywhere, not just in Victoria, but anywhere in the world. We also know that there are endangered, threatened grasses that are on this site. While there were not threatened fauna found during the survey, some of these grasses provide habitat to other animal species that are also threatened. So it is possible that there's that significance as well. We have a no local extinctions policy, and part of that means that if we have a species that is in danger of going extinct in Darebin, that we should do everything within our power to prevent that from happening. So this is exactly the case that we have right now here before us. We know that there are threatened grasses on that land. They may not be anywhere else in Darebin, or if so, they might not be at sites where they can be protected. Here is state land that can be protected. So the motion we've got here is to note where we're at, acknowledging that the land has already been compulsorily acquired. I understand from the circumstances that we're in and the advice from the officers that the chance of this grassland being retained is very low. But nonetheless, I believe that because of our no local extinctions policy and our commitment to biodiversity, we must do what we can to try to protect this land. Of course, we want more social and affordable housing here in Darebin, but to be honest, I find it a bit rich that the state government would plead desperation of, oh no, we have no public land to build housing on, when they're selling off millions and millions of dollars of public housing land, which is just covered in introduced grass species which have zero ecological value compared to the very great value here. And I understand that for those people who don't have an ecology background, you might have a look at the block and think, oh, well, you know, it just looks like grass. But there's so much in that grass that if we lose, will never be replaced again. We are the custodians of this land, and so I believe we have, not in the literal sense, but it is within Darebin, and so I hope that we can do what we can to protect it.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor McCarthy.
I'll reserve my seconding right for the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Lawrence.
Just a question, I'm just trying to locate the land because there's been, it's the north of Dumbarton, that large area. It's not the small linkage park on Dumbarton to Atkinson Reserve, or just because we don't have a reporter or map. Oh, I don't have it here. Just so I know.
Here, can you pass that to Councillor Lawrence?
I don't have that report. I was looking in the main document.
Okay. Are there further speakers?
Yes.
Yes.
Mayor Rennie, yeah, I'd like to speak in support of the motion. Obviously, this is a really large area. Of course, it's not as large as the 1.6 hectares that was referred to before, which is the Central Creek grasslands that run below Monies Road, and which I have to acknowledge, member for Thomastown, Peter Batchelor, was instrumental in implementing the Merri Creek Plan to Save. But it's the same issue, that it's a little tiny bit of pre-European settlement sitting there, and it's quite a large area. That's why I just wanted to double check it's not the other small linkages at the other end of Dumbarton. So it is significant size there, and also in terms of whole linkage back to Melbourne Water pipe track and all those areas, this is one of the rare opportunities to extend habitat corridor for the various species we're talking about. I assume it's kangaroo grass and other related ones. But in a broader sense, ultimately getting some re-veg work done on the Melbourne pipe water track and preserving this has a multiplier effect. So it's important that we signal to people we don't just see this as a plot of land, that it is part of the overall ecosystem there, which is in fact what Bundoora Park is in almost eyesight here too, and it's a remnant of that same ecology.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Greco?
I just had a couple of questions first. Firstly, I'd just like to understand, I'm not sure if it's in the report or in a previous report, is that what is the state government, in terms of the land size, how many dwellings are they expecting to develop as part of their project, their public housing project?
I'll refer that to an officer and hoping the right person will stand up. Ms Livier. Paragraph on page 4.
Through you, Mayor Rennie. Let's see.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, it's 110. So if you read the first paragraph on page 4 of the report, it specifies the estimate.
I would... So I would like to clarify that the exact percentage of that will be social housing hasn't yet been clarified by the state government. So the amount, what they're doing is going out to tender and seeking market responses. They don't
Actually, I think
yet
that's
know.
on 6 surplus land parcels, not just this one.
Yes,
Ms
that's
Wilkinson.
right. So they don't know to what degree this site would contribute to their overall target.
It's
across
one of
those
6 sites where they're trying to develop 110.
That's
so
right.
I think that needs clarification, Councillor Greco.
Sorry, just to further clarify that point, that's 110 social dwelling units, but it doesn't include any private development that might happen as a result of the program. Is that right?
So, Councillor Greco, who we don't know because that will depend on what the government goes out with and gets back. Now, do I have further speakers?
I just got another, just to clarify a few things. The other question is that, you know, in relation to the last point there, point number 5, which I think is the important point, is what actual offers has council made to the state government in relation to alternative land that could be used for this project that council owns? Can I just get some understanding from officers if we've made any offers and what those offers are?
Thank you, Ms Olivier.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, we've made a broad offer to work with them to help identify alternative sites. We haven't had a specific conversation about specific sites. At this stage, they haven't taken us up on the offer to have that conversation.
And just a final point then is, would the Preston precinct develop, you know, the idea of us developing here, would that be a suitable exchange? And that's why I asked for how many dwellings. Does the dwelling mix equal what the state government is trying to do, given that we're going down that path with the Preston precinct public social housing development idea?
Ms Olivier.
I would generally expect that we would be able to help them find an alternative site. Whether this one would specifically achieve their objectives, I don't know.
Thank you. So we'll keep moving. Are there any further speakers?
I'd like to move just a slight amendment to 5.
Yes, the words, please.
After alternative, after sites rather, identify alternative sites with a similar housing yield, public housing yield, and better access to services.
So that's been accepted by the mover. Is that acceptable to the seconder, Councillor McCarthy?
Sorry, I don't think that the current site is including public housing. So.
Social. Okay.
My intent is yes, social housing that we
Okay,
we only identify sites for the social benefit type of housing.
Thank you. Is that now acceptable?
Community benefit.
Okay. Thank you. That's now the motion. Are there further speakers?
Yeah, look, I'll just say a few words with this. Look, I'm glad that this motion has come up to us because, again, we're in a situation where we've got conflicting policy objectives and we have to try and find a pathway through. To find a realistic and real pathway through is to actually have real options on the table for the government to consider. And I'm glad that point number 5 has been strengthened because I was actually going in that direction, and Councillor Lawrence beat me to the punch because just to say that we can explore other areas won't cut it. I mean, we actually have to put ideas forward in order to try to get the government to the table in relation to this, and the fact that we're also saying not only identifying state government-owned land but also council-owned land, I think we're really stepping forward in goodwill to try and make something like this happen. And so I think that the way that the motion is now can hopefully open up negotiations with the state government, notwithstanding that they have already compulsory acquired the land. And then there's the issue of in terms of the economic, the financial remuneration or compensation that we get from the state government, and whether that actually, whether we can actually outbid that by what we offer up as an alternative and also achieving the same yield for the state government. So we really have to be, specific, very clear, and actually put basically land or money on the table in order to provide those stronger arguments that we need to the state government so that they can stay away
10 seconds.
from that precious strip of land.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there any further speakers? Councillor McCarthy, do you wish to exercise your right of reply? No? Okay, we'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Before we proceed to the next item, can I ask for someone to do a continuance? Thank you, Councillor McCarthy, seconded by Councillor Le Cerf. All those in favour? Thank you. So we're now going to 10:30. We're at item 8.6, and thank you to community members. 8.6, integrated weed management. Councillor Amir, seconded by Councillor McCarthy. Thank you. Councillor Amir.
So tonight we're adopting the draft strategy for consultation on weed management, and so this is the start of the conversation. Weed management is something that I knew very little about until coming on council, and since learnt just how technical it is, so it's good to see such a comprehensive plan here tonight. The two main issues that far and away come out most in regards to weed management is around reduction of glyphosate and also complaints about weeds on public or private property, and this strategy addresses and responds to both of those things with the ongoing shift away from glyphosate, acknowledging the extensive work the council has already done in shifting in this direction over recent years, including using steam weeding, hand weeding, different herbicides and weed mats, and other alternative strategies like using sugar, and being guided by local Aboriginal experts with strong knowledge of land management. I might keep this short because we are running behind time, but just to note, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to weed management. I'm interested in hearing from the community about ways that can be progressive ways to hopefully we can get some support in managing weeds and seeing weeds as a resource, not just a problem. I did have not one but two residents asked if Darebin could purchase a goat, including someone who volunteered to goat sit the goat to help eat some weeds. So I hope we can continue to hear those innovative solutions that we can explore to make sure that we get a good outcome with weed management.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor McCarthy?
In the interest of time, I'll reserve my right.
Thank you. Are there further speakers? There are none. Councillor McCarthy, would you like to speak?
No, that's fine. We can keep moving.
Thank you. All those in favour? That motion is carried. 8.7 Municipal Emergency Management Plan. That's moved by Councillor Lasserf and seconded by Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Lasserf.
So the Municipal Emergency Management Plan, all councils are required to develop and maintain a plan through the Emergency Management Act 1986, and that plan is audited every 3 years by the SES. And so once we adopt this new plan, this will go for audit actually later this year when it's due in December. The plan is really important in council and state government agencies' work in preparing, preventing, responding and recovering from emergencies. And it includes the roles, defining the roles and responsibilities of the various agencies, state government agencies, councils, adjoining councils, material aid organisations in the event of an emergency. It also goes, there's a lot of detail in there with many sub-plans depending on the different emergencies that we could be experiencing, but it also goes a lot to the relief and recovery process as well, which is sometimes the hardest part of an emergency in terms of recovering from what's happened and the bits that the community don't see when people are trying to rebuild their lives based on an event that they've experienced. The emergency management space is a rapidly changing and evolving one, and so as we learn from every emergency that we have to attend to, we make sure that we build and prepare ourselves for future emergency situations. The plan itself is developed by the Multi-Agency Municipal Emergency Management Plan Committee. The one thing that I learnt when I chaired that plan, because the Mayor is chaired that committee, is the amount of abbreviations that you have to learn as a result of that. But I would like to thank the MEMC, which is they're effectively known as, for their work on this plan and for the work that they do each and every day when they have to go out and support our communities and help our communities recover from emergencies. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Lasserf. Councillor McCarthy?
Once again, in the interest of time, I'll reserve my right.
Thank you. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Yes, Mayor Rennie. Look, I think it is just worth noting this report because we've actually haven't had many events, thankfully, in regards to fire cladding. We've had a lot of tea candle episodes, but we haven't had anything major, and we haven't had a major flood on a large scale, which was 25,000 houses. It was 4,500 houses out of the 25,000 that were flooded in 2003 around the sort of Eureka Stockade Day, 2nd or 3rd of December. And so there are a lot of agencies involved in this, but if we do face that type of emergency again, it is very serious because 10% of the city is in a stormwater flood path. And what we found in 2003, obviously Fairfield, Preston, Thornbury and parts of Reservoir were flooded. Thankfully, East Reservoir didn't have the clouds hover over them so long and there wasn't a 90 millimetre event, so some parts were spared. One of the things about flood management is that the dips in this city tend to have attracted more unit development, because the dips in the city were always flooded, and the 1 in 100 year flood's been happening every 20 or 30 years. But part of climate change is the intensification of rain events. So climate change is coming to us really not through bushfires that are affecting Whittlesea next door to us, but through urban floodways. And our drains aren't there to cope with those areas, that amount.
10 seconds.
So we have our most disadvantaged residents living in the cheapest housing in the most flood-affected areas.
Thank you, Councillor Lyons. Are there further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Yeah, look, I've got a question, and I'm sorry that I know that but I just want to understand in this document, because it's something that has been brought to my attention, whether this document makes reference to emergencies of a social nature, like, for example, social unrest or things like that, because a lot of these documents make reference to disasters, but whether we're equipped against any sort of social unrest that may occur in our city. So could I get some advice through you from the officers?
Thank you. I'll hand that to Mr Hewitt.
Through you, Mayor Rennie. Thanks for the question. These are really emergencies that deal with, the MEMP carries things like pandemics, hazardous materials, service disruptions, storm, structural fire, extreme heat. Extreme heat maybe captures some of the things you're talking about, Councillor Greco. Hostile act. They're the sorts of emergencies that this council will face. The pandemic and heat are probably the two that you might be most referring to.
Thank you, Mr Hewitt.
If I may have a supplement, will this emergency management plan cover, for example, situations and of a nature that, of a social nature? And what I mean there, and it's difficult for me to give an example because I don't want to sound alarmist in any way, but is of a social nature that could involve, like social unrest, that meaning where there are attacks on particular members of the community to a widespread level and things like that.
It can, particularly around hostile acts. Some of the hostile acts might include things like terrorism, for example. So it can impact, it's really about the consequence of the emergency that really impacts on the social aspects, and that relief and recovery, which can last many months, we know years in relation to the fires, Black Saturday fires, for example. So those social impacts are felt most heavily then.
Thank you. Are there any further speakers? There being none, Councillor McCarthy, do you want to exercise your right of reply? No?
No, other than just to draw to Councillor Greco's attention pages 76 and 77, which outline his point.
Thank you. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That brings us to 8.8, the draft Equity, Inclusion, Human Rights Framework. Moved by Councillor McCarthy, seconded by Councillor Newton. Councillor McCarthy.
I'm going to be really brief, Mayor, because I'm really conscious of time and I'm deliberately trying to minimise speaking, and I would encourage other councillors to think about that too if we can. This is a really important report though, and I think we recognise the importance of the consultation that comes ahead. I'm just going to draw to councillors' attention, well, first of all, just to thank the officers for their work on this and obviously all the inputs that have taken place so far, but just to draw to councillors' attention the goals under this proposed strategy, which speak to exactly the sorts of value sets that we've been talking about in this chamber earlier this evening. And I would say that that in relation to council's aspirations in this space, they are stronger than ever and very clear and very succinct. And in relation to council's commitment to both social justice, to diversity and inclusion, it is there, it is clear for all to see. I would also just point out that under the underpinning principles, there is language now there which we would not have seen in a document of this nature maybe 3 or 4 years ago because the language has shifted. And I'd particularly draw councillors' attention on page 46 of the council report, not the strategy, to talk about the fact that we now do speak quite specifically about climate justice, health equity, and of course referring to Australia's First Peoples in this context. So there is a significant set of shift here. There are some significant goals, and this is the evolution of some long-standing work. And I just thank officers and look forward to the community consultation to come.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Newton.
Nothing further to add. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I'd just like to make a few comments in relation to this report. And the comments that I'm going to raise, I've raised in other forums, and I think it's worthy to raise them in this public forum. Whilst I commend the work that's been done by officers in drawing this report together, but there are a few issues that I have with the report in terms of in terms that it does not stress enough issues around unconscious bias, and it does not deal enough with issues that have got to do with cultural diversity. Also in the report, if you look at the report, there's, in relation to the references, it does not make reference to the Multicultural Victoria Act. It does not make reference to the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, and they're important acts of the state of Victoria. It mentions other things, but it seems to omit that. The other question that I draw from looking at this is that there's a number of lenses that we use in relation to how this policy would work: a gender lens, a lifespan lens, a discrimination lens, and a socio-economic lens. And what I find that it doesn't, there should be also an emphasis on a cultural diversity lens, and that has not been, I think, adequately considered in this report. When we consider that more than 50% of the community, almost 50% of the community, is from a non-English speaking background. So it's a significant number in the community that are impacted by this. So I think they're important issues that I've raised, and I'm sad to see that they have not been included in this policy.
Councillor Greco, are there further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Mayor Rennie, look, it is regrettable we haven't got those linkages to state government policies, because it's very significant in Victoria. Our infrastructure for human rights protection and protection from racial vilification is underpinned by some very progressive legislation that actually says we accord human rights in Victoria not on the basis of your citizenship of Australia or Victoria. We accord human rights and respect human rights to everyone who is visiting here. Now, that was passed many years ago by a Labor government, and it was possibly not understood around the rest of the country, but it's very important when we're welcoming a huge amount of new arrivals. We're welcoming a huge amount of international students. Here, ranges from 5,000 to 10,000 a year, and other people on short-term work visas who we know are now exploited in a pretty mass scale of wage theft on a global scale, which is tarnishing Australia's reputation. So we need to link these back to these areas, because when I'm discussing things with recent arrivals, and I use, say, fair go, and we're going to give you a fair treatment and all that, even our language displays white entitlement. And they say, what, you've got to be fair to get a good go here? Rather ironically.
10 seconds.
And we actually need to connect this back to state and national commitments to human rights and the UN Charter because
Thank
that's
you,
the only
that's
way
time.
to govern a community like Darebin.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Are there further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That brings us to item 8.9, delegation of power. Councillor Greco, and second by Councillor Lasserf. Councillor Greco.
Oh, just very quickly, this is a routine item that comes to council on a regular basis in relation to the delegation of powers. This is absolutely necessary in order for council to do its job. It needs to, we as a council delegate authority to the CEO, and in turn that delegation flows down also to many of our officers in them doing their work. So it's pretty self-explanatory. It's and we have the whole list there of the delegated powers that officers need in order to carry out their functions.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Lasserf? Nothing to add. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
So I just had a question on this. I think I'm confused. Was our procurement policy, which is effectively a delegation to people, included in this or related to this?
Apologies, the procurement policy has been pulled from the agenda tonight, so the procurement policy won't be dealt with tonight.
Through Mayor Rennie, in terms of council's financial delegations in respect to its procurement, no, they are not included as part of this. Is that what you make reference to?
I have to apologise because I've been working off a hard copy. I'm concerned we're in breach of the Local Government Act if we haven't dealt with our procurement policy. And I'm just wondering whether we can amend this so that we actually deal with it, because we have not actually endorsed it in May 2018 or in May 2019.
I'll refer that to the CEO.
There's
Sorry, there's a point of order.
policy
We're not
coming.
debating a motion. There's a question that needs to be
Okay,
answered.
so Councillor Lawrence,
My question is, could we comply with the Local Government Act and include in this motion an endorsement of our current procurement policy? Because I'm kind of concerned that we've been 2 years and we're
Thank you for that
operating
question.
in
Apologies.
the back
Councillor
breach of the
Lasserf.
Act.
Sorry, please take a seat. You had a point of order. I think your point of order was correct. We've now got clarification of a question. If it's okay with you, we'll move on. I'll get Ms Wilkinson to answer that question.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, this question was explored at briefing just recently. And as I recall, the response was that we've not met the requirements of the Local Government Act, but the recourse is very limited. And further to that, it has been discussed at length with the Executive Director of Local Government Victoria and the Audit Committee, both of whom are very comfortable with the fact that Council is working on a current document. So I'm very comfortable in giving Council advice that they don't need to amend their delegations tonight to deal with that matter.
Just a supplementary question, in case my rambling, having not eaten,
Just the question.
Is it possible for us to endorse what we're currently doing, not change the policy, so that we're kind of within the Act tonight?
Ms Wilkinson.
My advice would
Sorry,
be...
can I just have a point of order? This is irrelevant to the matter at hand. It's relevant to the procurement policy debate, which has been item which has been pulled from the agenda. But the procurement policy.
So we're not going to debate that. So you've had a point of order that's not relevant to the matter at hand. The matter at hand relates to delegations of power. I think procurement is indeed something separate. So I will rule in favour of that point of order. Councillor Lawrence, you had a question. I will ask the CEO to specifically respond to that question, but I would like to continue with 8.9. Thank you.
Through you, Madam Mayor, the delegation specifically prescribe the requirements, so the expenditure authorisations for delegation. So from Council to me, so there's an authorisation for a certain expenditure level above which we need to go to bring an item to Council. So that's specifically in the delegation. In terms of the procurement policy and procurement strategy, The delegations are not specifically relevant to that. If council was of a mind to want to, for kind of a procedural process, just endorse the current policy just to let it make sure that we have full compliance, my advice would be to call for a report on that item specifically. Having said that, the intention is to bring the social and sustainable procurement strategy to council to the next council meeting. It has been withdrawn from tonight. It will be withdrawn from tonight's agenda. So, as I said, I feel confident that council can maintain its current position quite confidently without significant recourse from the state government for 3 more weeks.
Thank you. So we're now on item 8.9. We've heard from the mover. The seconder had nothing to add. Are there any further speakers? No, there being none, we'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. As has just been discussed, item 8.10 has been taken off this agenda and will be represented in 3 weeks' time. That brings us to item 8.11, 10-year capital.
I'll move an alternative motion to 8.11.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. We'll get that up on the screen. Can I just check that that is the motion that you intended?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Is there a seconder for that? Yep. Seconded by Councillor Amir. Thank you.
Sorry, just to be clear, is there anything over page? Because that's deleting points 3 and 4 and replacing point 3.
Just with point 3. Okay. So that is it.
To delete point 4?
Sorry, I misunderstood that. I thought
I'll second the motion.
item 3 was an addition, not a replacement.
Okay, that's now been, we hadn't started debate, so on the basis that we hadn't started, no, that's fine, you can withdraw. Councillor Lyons has seconded that. Councillor Greco, over to you.
Thank you, Mayor. This item deals with the 10-year capital works funding strategy, and the report goes through, there's a lot of information there in terms of how we're going to achieve that strategy, both from a financial perspective and also over a period of time. The report is quite thorough, and it goes through some underlying assumptions, and then it looks at the 10-year capital works funding strategy, and it's got a table there with the figures. So I commend the officers for doing this work. It's work that's been long overdue in terms of us having a long-term capital works program, and also what's most important in this report, that I should say, is that it talks about a borrowing regime for the council to adopt over a period of time in order to make some of these major projects happen. So that's all good news, and particularly I say that on the back of that for years we've had a very lazy balance sheet where we've not had borrowings in order to build new infrastructure in our city. But the point that I want to take the rest of the time about is that point number 3, because when you read this report, it makes the assumption that the Reservoir Leisure Centre is only going to be funded $16 million. Now, we're still going through the process of determining whether we go for a full redevelopment of the Reservoir Leisure Centre. So this report, the way that it's written, leaves a lot to be desired from my perspective, from a financial perspective, because what it's saying is that it's making the assumption that we borrow here $46 million, which would mean it's implied within that $16 million for the Reservoir Leisure Centre. But we haven't done that work yet. We haven't made a decision yet on whether we're going to go for the full halt in relation to the Reservoir Leisure Centre, which I believe that we should. So that's where this report falls short in regards to that. And it falls short from a financial and projection perspective because we have not included, because we haven't done the other work. It's, the idea of, the horse before the cart here. And so that's why I've put that further point there, the point number 3, and remove the other points, is that we need to give due and proper consideration to the cost of rebuilding or redeveloping the Reservoir Leisure Centre, given that it's under active consideration by council. Now, that needs to be done before, yes, that needs to be done before we can actually consider the 10-year capital works funding strategy in a proper way.
Thank you, that's time. Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Lawrence.
Yes, look, this, welcome this item, but I was alarmed at the fact that we would be preempting decisions and consultations with our community, especially when we've been told the extreme limitations of the current community consultation in regard to Reservoir Leisure Centre, which focused on safety and issues and status quo. So I welcome this amended motion because I was actually going to vote against this original one. But there is something very responsible in this motion, which I've been vocal critic of this council for some time, is that our budgets aren't internally funded correctly, as in accordance with the kind of objectives that's set by the Auditor General. And the reason that is because we've made many grand plans, but we have not actually made commitment to the borrowings that would cover those. So this is important that it goes through, but without the addition of point 3, I don't have, I breach the trust of my own ward if I just rubber stamp some of the underlying assumptions in there. So getting a further report to see where the options of reservoir that we're telling the community we're considering can fit into this is important. And it's also very important that we no longer, have the shame of having a kind of wish list, because until you commit to borrowings to substantiate your capital works program, it
10
is
seconds.
a bit of just words only and not action.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Are there further speakers?
I'd like to move an amendment, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy.
It's to replace point 3 on screen with the point 3 and 4 in the officer's report.
Thank you. Is that acceptable to the mover and the seconder?
As an amendment, I don't think it's a valid amendment. It's a point of clarification. I don't think it's a valid amendment because it goes contrary to the spirit and to the letter of point number 3, so it should be withdrawn.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. I'll get advice on that. So we've received advice that that is directly opposite, so on that grounds I will rule that amendment out. So you can foreshadow that as an alternative.
In that case, I'll speak against the motion as listed on screen and foreshadow that I'll be, if this doesn't succeed, then I'll be moving the officer recommendation. And I do so because I think that there is a flaw in point 3 in terms of the logic. And while I appreciate councillors' concerns about understanding what the proposal is at Reservoir Leisure Centre in the future, this is a financial strategy from this point in time right now, and as councillors should be aware, based on the briefings that we've had, you can adjust your financial strategy as you proceed forward, as new information becomes available. These are the underlying assumptions, and I would just say that the point 3 seems to imply that we don't know what the underlying assumptions are at this point in time. The underlying assumptions right now are listed very clearly on page 62 of the council report that's listed there. We need to keep moving, councillors. We need to proceed with a financial plan that is actually coherent, that does do exactly, and I would echo the sentiments of the mover and seconder of the motion, that now is the time to borrow. That is a very good strategy in the context of we find ourselves. However, until we make a resolution in relation to the Reservoir Leisure Centre, we are operating on a set of questions here and a set of assumptions. And those assumptions are actually council's assumptions at this point in time. So I can't support the way that this is proposed to be altered against what the evidence is that we actually have in the report. Therefore, I'll be voting against it, and I foreshadow that I'll be moving a motion that is the same as the officer's report.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there any further speakers? No, in that case, I will... You've spoken, Councillor Lyons. Councillor Amir.
Yeah, I'd like to propose an amendment. The amendment is to replace item... Sorry, hang on. So the amendment would be to include what's currently listed as items 3 and 4 of the agenda, and to replace item 3 with, once council has confirmed an agreed position and scope on Reservoir Leisure Centre, council receives an updated 10-year capital works funding strategy for consideration.
So can I check that what you're saying is replacing 3 would actually be 0.5 because you're wanting to put 3 and 4 back in?
It would make sense for it to keep that around reservoir, but it would be the final one.
Okay. Councillor Amir, can I get you to read out 0.5 slowly?
Yeah. Once council has confirmed an agreed position and scope on the Reservoir Leisure Centre development, council receives an updated 10-year capital works funding strategy for consideration.
So the first question, I'll get governance advice on this also, to find out whether, with that additional 0.5, whether this would still be contrary to... Okay, so... Here, yeah, maybe if you could even pass what you've got written down. So 0.3 and 4 go back in. While we're getting that up on screen, can I have another motion to extend the meeting, please, just so we don't get caught? So moved by Councillor McCarthy, seconded by Councillor Surf. All those in favour? Thank you. It's just done so we don't. So, Councillor Greco, I will seek advice about whether this remains contrary. Sorry, whether this remains opposite. And if it does remain opposite, it will be ruled out, but we'll see. So thank you everyone for your patience. I think we're probably going to get it up on screen soon. So I'll now seek advice on whether that is opposite to what was there. Councillor Amir, you can confirm that that's what you intended? Yep. Stephen, what's your advice in relation to whether that's opposite or whether that's consistent?
Well, through Mayor Rennie, I think the amendment is an addition to the motion, so it's satisfactory.
Okay, so the governance advice is that amendment is not opposite, but nevertheless it falls to Councillor Greco and Councillor Lyons to say whether you would accept that amendment or not.
Just before they do, can I just propose the slight correct the words, the wording of point 5 needs to say that council, once it has confirmed an agreed position. I'm sure that we'll be wordsmithed after the meeting. It's fine. We keep moving.
Yeah, let's just keep moving. Councillor Greco, do you accept that amendment?
I can't accept it. It goes contrary to the spirit of the
That's
previous.
fine. So I'll seek a seconder for that amendment. Is there a seconder? Councillor McCarthy, thank you. Councillor Amir, do you wish to speak to the amendment?
Just briefly, we are in the early stages of understanding the needs for Reservoir Leisure Centre. Of course, we all want to make a decision that will put that facility in to provide what the community needs. As has been acknowledged by Councillor Greco and Lawrence and others, we haven't yet made that decision. And as noted by Councillor McCarthy, we will need to be responsive as new decisions are made. So this was proposed in an effort to acknowledge the importance of Reservoir Leisure Centre and to be really clear in noting that a particular position has been made in this report that may or may not actually reflect the final place where council lands on that decision of RLC.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor McCarthy, do you wish to speak to the amendment?
Reserve my right as the seconder.
Thank you. Are there speakers against or other speakers for the amendment? Councillor Greco.
Yeah, look, I'm going to speak against this amendment. I think this amendment, and I'm disappointed that that the amendment has not been ruled out because it literally goes contrary to the spirit of the original motion. It's just been a clever procedural manner of trying to diminish what the original motion was about. The original motion was about ensuring that before we endorse anything, that we go through proper due process. And that proper due process is about looking at the evidence, looking at the community expectations, community needs, considering that before we commit ourselves to a 10-year capital works funding strategy and before we commit ourselves to underlying assumptions. Because the two are actually interrelated. The underlying assumptions and the 10-year plan are actually related depending on where we land, as its phrase has been used, where we land with the Reservoir Leisure Centre. What we're doing here is basically saying, Reservoir Leisure Centre, the writing's on the wall, $16 million, paint job, that's what you're going to get, forget about it, and we're just going to go through the process of listening and hearing and all that sort of stuff. But we're already flagging here to the community that Reservoir Leisure Centre, the whole process that we're going through, it's just going to land at $16 million because that's all we're going to borrow for. And I can predict now, councillors, that's what will happen. That's what will happen because that's why this report has come to us in this particular fashion.
Councillor Greco, are there further speakers on the amendment? Councillor Lawrence.
Yes, look, this is such a serious issue. I certainly will end my local government career on this issue, one way or the other, I can assure you. And that, you know, there's ways that, some of those ways I won't be able to have control of. I've been having this argument for nearly 5 years. I'm up to the third CEO. I'm having the same argument. Because of the Local Government Act, I can't share with my community what's been said time and time again. Take it or leave it, it's up to them. And what I've been told in this council, in briefings, in consultations with different CEOs, with different executives, hoping to save their jobs, you have to put up with $11, $12 million. Oh, it's inched up to 16. It's a disgrace. This is preempted. It's organisationally grounded, this assumption. And when we talk about human rights and the intersectionality of disadvantage, I'd let you consider why does Reservoir, where this facility located, have 25% more lung cancer than Australia? Why does this area have 75% more liver cancer than Australia? Are we part of Darebin? We're coming here again and again and again for 3 years for the same reason. Give some equal treatment. I've been told by a previous mayor, geographic equality isn't part of the council. I've been told by a previous CEO, geographic equality isn't part of the council.
10 seconds.
That breaches everything we've written and committed on these fluffy papers about human rights. We're talking about
That's time.
providing
Thank you,
equal
Councillor Lawrence.
services.
Are there further speakers to the amendment? No, I'll put the amendment to the vote. All those in favour? And against? I have a casting vote. I'll exercise my casting vote in favour of that amendment. So that is now the motion. We've heard on this motion from Councillor Greco, Councillor Lawrence, Councillor McCarthy and Councillor... I think Councillor Amir spoke on the amendment. Are there further speakers to the motion? No, there being no further speakers, I'll put the
I'll
motion...
speak to the motion.
Councillor Lawrence, you've already spoken to the motion. You seconded it, you spoke to the motion.
This is now a new motion in contradiction to the previous.
I've got an amendment, I've got no further speakers. So unless there's a further speaker, I'm going to put the motion to the vote.
I move an amendment.
Councillor Lawrence, you're not able to move an amendment because you seconded the motion.
So I can't move an amendment to drop point 3.
No, you can't move an amendment because you've already spoken. So I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour?
I'm happy to put the amendment to drop.
I've already done the vote. So that motion is carried.
Sorry, just a point of order. You didn't call for those against.
Mayor, I didn't get an opportunity to vote.
Okay.
Yeah. And,
Okay, there was
and
a
I've heard
majority.
my
Okay.
side here, so
No,
I
thank you.
wasn't-
Apologies. Okay. I'll just seek some advice. So I'm asking for advice in relation to this now.
Mayor Rennie, your local law is quite clear. An amendment is carried. Once an amendment is carried, the motion as amended becomes the substantive motion before the meeting, and that substantive motion must then be put to the vote. So, Mayor Rennie, you're correct in, after that amendment was carried, to put the matter to the vote, and that's what I believe you did.
So just to clarify, would the correct thing now to be to move to the vote again and complete the vote, or to go back? Councillor Williams mentioned she had an amendment after I had done half the vote. Do I go back to do the vote? I just want to make sure that I'm getting good advice.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, your local law is very clear. Once the amendment has been carried, it becomes a substantive motion before the meeting. There's no opportunity for further amendments. The substantive motion must be put to the vote. After that's put, there can be...
Just a point of order.
Yeah, I'm going to seek further clarification, Councillor Greco, because we do amend things more than once. So,
through you, Mayor Rennie, perhaps I can offer an alternative interpretation, given the hour. So any number of amendments may be proposed to a motion, but only one amendment may be accepted by the chairperson at a time. The local law is very clear that a mover and a seconder of the motion, the substantive motion, cannot move amendments, which is the reason why Councillor Lawrence couldn't move an amendment. But Councillor Williams, who was not a mover or a seconder, is able to make move an amendment, provided it meets the criteria of the local law. So my advice at this point is that you allow the amendment to be heard, given that the vote wasn't completed.
okay, thank you for that advice. So, Councillor Williams, we'll go to you for your amendment.
My amendment is to actually delete number 3, endorses the underlying assumption of the 10-year capital works funding strategy.
Okay, thank you for that. Is that acceptable to the mover and the seconder?
No.
No. So
I'm not the mover and seconder.
the mover and the seconder are...
But then it goes back to the officer's recommendation, so I don't know.
The amendment is to eliminate number 3.
Through Mayor, I don't believe that's opposite, that's just again amending the motion, but changing.
And also take out the 10-year capital works in number 4.
So number 4 would read,
Be taken out.
Take out actually all of it, leave 4 out.
so Councillor Williams's amendment...
What I'm trying to do is obviously...
Sorry, I'm not, the intent will get discussed if we get to debate. So your amendment is to eliminate 3 and 4. I'll go back now and ask for officer advice again. With the elimination of items 3 and 4, does this, are we now circular, are we now back in a position where we are opposite?
Through Mayor Rennie, I think it's still a change to the motion and would be satisfactory if that's how it's going to be.
Okay, thank you for that advice. So Councillor Williams, that's been found to be a legal amendment. I would now move and ask the mover and the seconder if they accept that amendment. Do you accept the amendment, Councillor Greco and Councillor Lyons?
Yes. I accept the...
Yep, you accept the amendment? Okay.
I think we're going round and round in circles, so I'd like to put a procedural motion that we put the motion now and then we vote on
The
it.
motion now be put? Okay, so we're now voting...
Is this motion here?
This
with the two
is...
points? Yes?
No, it's been accepted. They accepted. So we are now voting, just so we're clear, we are now voting on whether the motion be put, and the motion that would be put, if this procedural motion passes, is the motion that is now on the screen. Okay? Which is this, which is back to where we were. So, this is a motion that the motion now be put. All those in favour? That it be put. Okay, so we've now, and against? Okay, so we are now going to vote on this motion. Okay.
My vote be recorded as I voted against the motion being put.
Okay, so
I vote to be recorded that I voted against the
we'll
motion.
note that Councillor Greco voted against. Thank you. We're now voting on this motion. All those in favour? And against? Can I just do that again? 4 against and all those in favour?
4 against 4.
4 and 4. I will exercise my vote against. Okay, thank you. So that is lost.
On a casting vote.
Okay.
I'll move the officer's recommendation as listed in the report.
Okay, thank you. Seconded by Councillor Lesurf. Okay, so we're doing 8.11. We'll get the officer recommendation back on the screen.
Can I move that the vote be put, given we've already discussed this at length?
Okay, so we have a procedural motion that the motion now be put. All those in favour? And against?
And my vote be recorded that I voted against this gag motion.
We will note that Councillor Greco voted against this. Okay, so we're now voting on...
I voted against the gagging motion.
I think it is offensive and, not helpful. It's not helpful to go back to that language. That's the language we were in at 6:30. I would just like to remind councillors, I'm not interested in points of order, I'd just like to remind councillors that that type of language is unhelpful and offensive and does nothing to the way in which we work together. I would ask people to restrain from using that kind of language. We have actually debated this item for a good half an hour. I don't think anyone could say that anyone had been gagged. This has been a half-hour debate. So the motion has been put, that this now be put. That motion was carried. So this, we are now going to vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried.
My vote be recorded that I voted against this.
Thank you, Councillor Williams and Councillor Lawrence the same. So thank you. We'll note that Councillor Williams, Greco and Lawrence voted against. So we're now at item 8.12.
Happy to move.
That's moved by Councillor McCarthy and seconded by Councillor Lesurf. Councillor McCarthy.
Given the hour, Mayor, I'll make it very brief. This item here simply endorses the concept design for the indoor multi-sport sports stadium and obviously continues the engagement and consultation with key stakeholders. It seems like a small set of words, but it's actually a really important thing because it actually takes us to that next stage in this significant project, which we have just adopted a funding strategy for, which is fantastic. So I would just draw to councillors' attention on the page 69 of the actual council report, the key elements of the preferred option, and I'll just leave it at that because I'm conscious of time and fully support it. But thank the officers for all their work, and obviously would also like to just once again thank the community effort that brought this project to council's attention a number of years ago, which remains true to the form of the project as listed.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Lasserve. Nothing to add? Are there any further speakers?
Say that thank you to all of the officers for all of the work that they've done to get us to this point, and it's an exciting time, and I'm glad that we're moving forward on this.
Thank you, Councillor Lasserve. Are there any further speakers? No, we'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. We're now at item 8.14. Before we start this item, I'll just remind people that we received a written submission. That person wasn't able to come, but you've all seen the written submission, I hope. So moved by Councillor Greco, thank you, and seconded...
Very quickly.
Sorry, we'll just... seconded by Councillor McCarthy.
Very quickly.
Councillor Greco.
This is a request that's been made to us from the Advancement League. It's a serious request, and the request is that asking that the status of the management status, that is the Committee of Management, be transferred from the council to the league. And the report goes through the justification for that, and also I understand that other government departments are in concert in relation to this particular handing over to the Advancement League the management of the place. And also, as you mentioned, Mayor, that we received a submission in regards to this, again supporting council moving its away from being the Committee of Management and handing it over to the Advancement League. I think it's important that we do that, and I think it's important that we do that because it ticks all the boxes in terms of self-determination, sovereignty, and allowing the Aboriginal community to have control and full management of the resources which they in the past have been managing, and that there's no encumbrances from the council in relation to future operations of that place and that centre.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor McCarthy?
Fully support the recommendation as listed and thank the submitter as well for the submission, and I'll just leave it there in the interest of time.
Thank you. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Yes, Mayor Rennie. Yeah, I'm delighted to support this motion, and obviously there's been a long history and association with the City of Northcote, and then, of course, the City of Darebin in supporting the Aboriginal Advancement League on this site, including significant $800,000 plus upgrades on the site, and to formally transfer the land is in some ways bits of paper. The reality is the community has been there. It's a major hub across the state, and it is actually an ongoing successful partnership in terms of diversity and social inclusion in this city. So I commend the officers and councillors to support this.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. We'll move to 8.15.
Happy to move that, Mayor, with the additional words, which I'm happy to read out.
Okay. They're on screen, Councillor McCarthy,
right. Yep,
so
thank
if
you.
you're happy with, just check that the words on screen are what you expect to see, and then I'll ask for a seconder.
Right down to the sense. Yep.
Okay. Is there a seconder for that motion? Councillor Williams? Councillor McCarthy?
Thank you, Mayor. I'll just keep it very brief. This report is the awarding the contract for the Edwards Lake Park Athletic Track surface replacement. Councillors, of course, have a confidential report with further information than is available in the public report, but I would just note that this is obviously a significant project for the local community and I think for Darebin more generally. The process has been robust and in line with obviously our policies, and I look forward to seeing it completed.
Great. Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Williams, do you want to add anything?
Just to know that the locals that use it, the athletic club, they're very much looking forward to the new track, considering there's many potholes on that track. So very much looking forward to having that whole new track redone.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there any further speakers? No, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. 8.16. Councillor Williams, I'll wait until we've got the motion so you know what you're seconding. Councillor Williams, can you look on the screen and confirm that's what you wish to second?
I'm happy to second that.
Okay, so that's moved by Councillor Williams, seconded by Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Williams.
It's just pretty straightforward that this is the contractor that will be doing the works at the Bundoora Oval for the new change rooms on Snake Gully Drive.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Anything to add, Councillor
In the
McCarthy?
interest of time, I'll reserve my right.
Thank you. Any further speakers? No? I'll then put that straight to the vote, I think. All those in favour? That motion is carried. 8.17. Councillor Williams, thank you. We'll just make sure that what's on screen is what you're intending to move. And then I'll seek a seconder.
Yep.
Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Williams.
Once again, it's just a contract awarded to the constructions of the new change rooms at J.E. Moore Park North in Reservoir. And it's just a pretty straightforward contract, obviously allowing them the 10% 10% in case the project expenditure of any use or requirement for unforeseen situations that may occur.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor McCarthy, anything to add?
Only to add that this now transitions this facility to a female-friendly change room situation, which is part of our broader strategy with our change rooms across Darebin.
Thank you. Any further speakers? No, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That brings us to the end of consideration of reports. Consideration of responses to petitions, notices, motions and general business. There are none. Notices of motion have already been dealt with. Reports of standing committees, there are none. Records of assemblies of councillors. Moved by Councillor McCarthy, seconded by Councillor Greco. All those in favour? Reports by Mayor and councillors. Moved by Councillor Le Cerf, seconded by Councillor McCarthy. All those in favour? Consideration of reports considered confidential. There are none because they've been held in an open meeting. That brings us to the close of the meeting. Thank you very much. I know that was a marathon session. I really appreciate the commitment and particularly the way we managed to get through a large number of reports in a very efficient way towards the end. Thanks, councillors. See you next week.